The Dark Tower has been rebuilt, it was said. From there the power was spreading far and wide, and away far east and south there were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these. But they had no name. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. If you're watching live, I apologize for the brief false start. My computer had chosen that exact moment, to begin a very complicated backup and was eating all of my bandwidth. So that has been put a stop to, and now we can continue with the show without, hopefully, any more encoding errors in my video as it goes out. This week, Roast Mutton, Chapter 2 of The Hobbit, including a surprisingly long journey condensed into a surprisingly short span of time, a vanishing Gandalf, and Bilbo's first successful adventure, quote, very much, unquote. This opening quote that I started with comes, of course, from the second chapter of The Lord of the Rings, In the Shadow of the Past, where the narrative voice is laying out the details of the darkening world and includes that note about trolls. Trolls are different now. Trolls are more dangerous now. Trolls are probably not going to be, working class Cockney trolls anymore. This makes the trolls particularly interesting because they aren't retconned in a subsequent edition of The Hobbit, as many incidental details are. They're repositioned consciously within the narrative of The Lord of the Rings, acknowledging, highlighting all but the discontinuity between the trolls as they are presented in The Lord of the Rings and William, Tom, and Bert as we meet them here in the pages of The Hobbit. Andrea is joining me in the chat this evening. Good evening, Andrea. Good Lord, it's a bit of a ramshackle start. I hope that things become a little more stable as we continue. We will get, of course, to the trolls. We will get to this really fascinating and deliberate, almost provocative inclusion of these comedic trolls when we get to them. But for now, we must begin a long way from the trolls, back in the safety of Bag End, where Bilbo wakes the following morning, the morning after the unexpected party, somewhat befuddled, maybe just a little disappointed that the adventure seems to have rolled out like the tide and left him beached, I suppose, would be the metaphor there, right? Until that is, Gandalf shows him the letter on his undusted mantelpiece. This letter, in fact. Thorin and company to burglar Bilbo, greeting. For your hospitality, our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. Terms, cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations, and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp. Trusting that you will be punctual, we have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorin and company. And this is, of course, one of the closer things that we get to an in-universe joke. I think it is a fairly well-observed and well-attested fact that Tolkien, for all of his innumerable strengths as a writer, as a secondary creator, was not a particularly funny writer. And certainly by the time that we get to The Lord of the Rings, not many characters in that book are, outright cracking jokes. But this, I think, is one of his more successful pieces of satire, of in-universe satire, because here we have Thorin and company poking a gentle fun at Bilbo for his conduct the night before, as well as, I suppose, his essential nature. You'll remember that in the aftermath of the song, Bilbo is asking for specifics. He adopts this legalistic, lawyerly persona and begins to interrogate the dwarves as to their plans, as to their purpose, to which Thorin replies, well, didn't you hear us singing the Misty Mountains song? Didn't you hear us? We laid out the whole thing and explained our purpose. But I guess if you need it in prose rather than in poetry, here it is. Here is the plan. And now we take that one step further to offer this somewhat snide, somewhat snarky, legalistic encapsulation of their undertaking. Thorin and company to burglar Bilbo, greeting, hiring him there on the strength of the role that Gandalf has assured them he is well suited for. And we are kind of leaning into, a mid-century bureaucratic mind here, I suppose. This is something which modern readers, contemporary readers of The Lord of the Rings as of its of The Lord of the Rings, of The Hobbit as of its publication, this is the kind of language with which they would have been very familiar. This is a very formal and technical kind of application of English, very common to bureaucrats all across that fine land. More importantly, perhaps, there is an ambiguity here as to their purpose, as to their intent, because certainly we could buy that they are reluctant to disturb his esteemed repose and await his respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, but it is also just as likely that they believe that he will not come. In fact, we might infer that that is the purpose of Gandalf returning to Bag End to forcibly wake Bilbo, is that the dwarves are right on the verge of absolutely leaving without him, regardless of how much Gandalf assures them that Bilbo will be needed down the road. I want to share here, just because I think it is great. This is the actual letter. Tolkien wrote this letter in Tangwar. This is Thorin's letter to Bilbo as it is replicated in John Ratliff's The History of the Hobbit. Tolkien wrote this himself. It is a phonetic English transliteration of what is in the letter as it appears in the book. It was his original intention that this should be printed in copies of The Hobbit, but it simply was too expensive, particularly during the first round of printing. So it wasn't included. But as I say, it is included in John Ratliff's History of the Hobbit. And I just wanted to include it because it is beautiful and wonderful. And for the tiny detail there, you can note the double underlined section there on the right-hand page, on the second of the two pages, which is, of course, the word precisely, right? We await you precisely. This is going to be the last time. In fact, Bilbo is about to be mocked for paying so much attention to time and the passage of time. It's another way in which Thorin and company are poking fun at the conventions, at the manner, at the kind of social order of the Shire. It is an orderly place, but they are going into a very different kind of world, and they're pulling Bilbo with them. So let us waste no more time. Let us get on the road because, of course, we've got a lot of ground to cover. We've got a surprising amount of ground to cover. One of the things which stands out as you are reading this section of The Hobbit is how quickly this ground is covered. That's true, if we're candid, about the entire book, right? Tolkien certainly has a vague idea of the geography of Middle-earth at this point, but that idea is so refined by the time that we get to The Lord of the Rings that this kind of suspension of disbelief, this Jacksonian suspension of disbelief when it comes to travel time and distance just doesn't cut it. So we have this somewhat ungainly combination of Bilbo's account and Frodo's account, through particularly from the Shire to Rivendell, right? But all the same, I think that this book manages to accomplish in a very deft sketch of the landscape, if not the detail of what they are passing through, if not the actual geography that's presented to us by Frodo's journey, the thematic import of that journey. We're really getting the sense of the progression here of these successive and sequential barriers to progress, the kind of barriers that Frodo meets. Although, it's interesting, Tom Shippey in his book, is it in his book, The Road to Middle-earth, I believe, he asserts or notes, I should say, a really interesting pattern at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, which is this jagged sawtooth pattern of Frodo getting himself into a scrape and then arriving at what Shippey refers to as a safe house, right? So he leaves Bag End and he gets into trouble, but then he's safe again. And then we get Old Man Willow and he's safe again. And then we get the Barradans and then he's safe, well, safe to a certain extent, right? By the time he gets to Bree, then we get Weathertop and then he's safe again. And that one of the narrative challenges to Tolkien in that entire book, in the first arc of that book, I guess, in the first book of The Fellowship of the Ring, by the way, happy 71st birthday to The Fellowship of the Ring. 71 today, 71 years ago, that book was published for the very first time. Part of the narrative challenge facing Tolkien through that first book of The Fellowship of the Ring is this kind of narrative inertia. Frodo keeps stalling out and finding himself in places which seem peaceful, which seem safe, which are then ultimately, of course, more often than not proved to not be safe or to be only temporarily safe. But I find that structure really fascinating, particularly when it's in conjunction with or contrasted to Bilbo's progression, which is this much more natural, much more kind of hero's journey progression from the known to the unknown, from, as I've said before, the West to the wild. Bilbo's journey, it is demarcated by specific obstacles and demarcated by specific events, right? None of which we have come to yet. But I suppose that's actually not true. We're going to reach the first threshold this evening, in fact. Let's get into our first slide of the journey here, and then we can discuss a little more specifically what we're dealing with. At first, they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had been obliged to camp where they could, but at least it had been dry. The reference here to the Lone Lands dates from the 3rd edition, which is the post The Lord of the Rings edition, and thus features, again, that sense of a more developed geography here. The geography of Eriador has been more fully filled in by the time we get to that point in the history. Eriador, of course, translates appropriately enough as Lonely Lands. So we're seeing this kind of philological work kind of filter back in from The Lord of the Rings, this more developed sense of place and time filtering back in from The Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit by the time that we get to that edition. I've included it here because this is the modern edition. This is what most people are going to be reading. And as I mentioned before, right, the development of the geography and the timeline is complicated as we move from the initial 1937 publication of The Hobbit into the 1954 publication of The Fellowship of the Ring. But it is not a simple process. It is not a straightforward development. It's not just a case of taking out a map that has a lot of blank spaces and filling them in. Tolkien is generally very painstaking and I guess imperfectly good, but still really quite good, still very good at placing these events in time and space. It is important to him, not because, as is often supposed, I've commented before about the common critique of Tolkien being that it's pages and pages of landscape description. And it's just not. Like, crack open the book. Take a look. It is not pages and pages of landscape description. There's a lot of travel. The travel is important, but the travel isn't important for its own sake. Tolkien is not replicating a Tolkienian quest structure here the way that subsequent authors invariably would, to the extent that the long journey quest structure becomes the de facto mode of storytelling in the fantasy genre for 70 years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. He's not replicating it because it is a hallmark of his own writing. He's doing it to root us in time and place, to help us suspend our disbelief, to create that illusion of depth, that illusion of history, because the geography is also always inescapably temporally rooted, right? We're not just passing a forest and a hill and a stream and a field. We're passing these ancient castles glowering on the mountaintop. The further we go here, through the close lands to the Shire, right? It's interesting that in the 5th revision, in the 1960 edition, the 5th phase, I should say, per Ratliff, Tolkien does come back to this chapter and changes everything. And he does include, I think I pulled it here, in the version from 1960, the dwarves explicitly visit Bree and stay at the Prancing Pony, which is, quote, well known to the hobbits of the east side of the Shire. Bree was as far as Bilbo's knowledge reached, even by hearsay, end quote, which is lovely. And another example of Tolkien coming back and kind of trying to fold the Hobbit into the larger world of The Lord of the Rings. But as I say, what is important here is not just the sense that we are traveling a great distance, because I'm not sure in The Hobbit that we get a sense that we are traveling a great distance. It just kind of passes pretty quickly. As I said in a recent podcast, which has eluded me, which has escaped me. Perhaps it was the last episode of There and Back Again. I was looking at the journey time from the Shire to Bree and back again, or the Shire to Rivendell and back again. That's what it was. It was exactly the Shire to Rivendell and back again. And noting that for all that Frodo and company at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings have all of these misadventures, and they set off with Strider, and they have to take the Northern Road, and we spend a lot of time in the company of Knickerbreakers, and we kind of navigate cross-country, it still takes Bilbo and the dwarves longer, significantly longer, to get to Rivendell. The point is this. The geography isn't just geography, it is also history. It is also world building, it is also depth. And we're still, even in this early juvenile form of Tolkien's Legendarium, we're still moving through it with a great deal of purpose. So, Thorin and company travel onward. They are crossing a fast-moving river. It's only then that they notice that Gandalf has disappeared without a word of farewell. They try to make a camp right after fording the river, but one of the ponies is frightened by things unknown, possibly the trolls, possibly something darker out there in the wild night, and flees. The pony, unfortunately, flees into the river and is drowned, taking with it the bulk of their food and provision, which motivates the next adventure, which is to say that the dwarves, unable to light a fire, are sitting in the wet, grumbling and bemoaning their fate when they see a spark of firelight on a nearby hill, and Bilbo is dispatched to investigate, being the resident burglar. And it's really important. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's a fairly well-observed, I think, part of Bilbo's character here. As we are kind of moving between the Baggins and the Took, as we are mediating between these two things, these two opposed instincts and ideals, which sharpen and highlight and contrast the other, right, as he holds them in suspension here. It is an interesting detail that Bilbo is specifically dispatched to go and look at the fire and see what is happening, and he takes it on himself to have an adventure. He takes it on himself to not return to the dwarves empty-handed, but rather to engage in his first bit of burglarious activity. We'll get to that. Let's take a look first, though, at the way that the trolls are presented to us. Here we are. As for Bilbo walking primly toward the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously, trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that from the great heavy faces of them and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all, at all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls. "Never a blinking bit of man-flesh that we had for long enough," said the second. What ear William was a-thinking to bring us to these parts at all beats me, and the drink running short, what's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. So, class distinction is the inescapable mode by which we can understand exactly what is happening here. And I pulled that first or the last part of that preceding paragraph, I suppose, just to highlight this. It is not simply the case that the trolls are presented as speaking in an idiosyncratically working class dialogue that would have been immediately identifiable to any of the presumably middle-class school children who were reading this book upon its publication. It's that the narrative voice positions Bilbo as being opposite to this working-class demeanor, right? How is he walking toward the fire? He is walking primly toward the red light. And he sees there 3 large persons sitting around this large fire. They're toasting mutton on long spits of wood, right? It's barbaric, but maybe it's actually kind of cozy and welcome. That's certainly the first instinct that we get, right? Toasting mutton on long spits of wood, licking the gravy off their fingers. Okay, well, that is not polite. That is not, courteous, but okay, it is at least welcoming. There was a fine, toothsome smell and a barrel of good drink at hand. Okay, well, we know that hobbits like good drink, so none of this is particularly bad, except it is perhaps a little rough and ready. It is perhaps a little low class, right? It's not quite up to Bilbo's usual standards. He doesn't have, well, I guess he is carrying a pocket handkerchief at this point because Gandalf brought him some from Bag End, but, he doesn't have all of his many pieces of cutlery laid out on the table before him, but the problem is that they are trolls. And we emphasize how vulgar the trolls are in that last line of the second paragraph there. Not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all. That very self-conscious, somewhat effete repetition of "at all" there, just really driving the point home. And then we get this attributed dialect here from the trolls. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," says the first troll. And even the mutton, right? They are eating sheep. They are not eating lamb, a gentlemanly middle-class kind of meat. Even in the 1930s, that is the kind of thing that the middle classes would enjoy of a Sunday afternoon. No, it's mutton. It's the peasantish version of that. It's the vulgar working-class version of that. And then we ascend still further. Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough. What the hell William was a-thinking of to bring us into these parts beats me, and the drink running out too. So first, the use of the word hell really stands out, really kind of rings a bell if you're paying attention to that kind of thing. And then the drink running out, the drink running short. What's more, says the second. So this is the repositioning of the trolls as working class individuals, a kind of parodic working class individuals, right? Because, well, okay, let's distinguish this first. Yes, he is caricaturing these trolls as working class men. That's, rough and ready, kind of the poorly mannered working class individuals. But he isn't just making them comedic. He isn't just making them ridiculous. He's using comedy to mediate and to moderate their more frightening characteristics, right? Because the dwarves are about to be eaten by these trolls. Bilbo is about to be eaten by these trolls. These trolls, we learn, have consumed more than a village worth of people since they have come down from the hills. They are dangerous. They are savage. So there is a class schematic at work here that goes somewhat beyond ridiculing these uneducated trolls by giving them half-hearted Cockney accents. Something else is happening here, which is the danger of the working class. They are comedic, yes, but their propensity for violence, their propensity for bloodshed, their rapacious hunger, their refusal to observe the kind of rules that keep a society healthy and strong and stable. See all my previous comments about social stability, right? And whether or not it is a good thing. But their contravention of those established rules makes them just as dangerous as the fact that they are out there taking villagers from their homes and eating them in the night, or that they're about to eat the dwarves too. So Tolkien is really managing to walk this line, I think, between the comedic but the genuinely, authentically dangerous. I think that the positioning of the dwarves as this working class boogeyman, right? As this specter of working class violence, which asterisk, for those of you who perhaps are joining me just now and don't know me very well, is completely unjustified, indefensible, and unfair, right? Okay, this is not like a real bit of social critique that we're getting from Tolkien here. But what he is doing is leveraging the kinds of stereotypes, the kinds of archetypes that are common in middle-class political thought in the 1930s, and let's be honest, persist in the personal politics of the middle classes even to today, for as much as we have a middle class anymore. So this choice is not a casual choice, and it is not a strictly comedic choice, because by positioning them in this way, he is also introducing a danger of very immediate and physical violence that will be communicable to children without even the necessary, fairy tale association of trolls. Okay. I know, it's bad. It's bad, but it is at least, purposeful. It is at least understandable. Okay, let's get into our main point of discussion for this evening. I guess I should asterisk this by going back to the notion of Bilbo undertaking this adventure, right? He doesn't want to go back to the dwarves empty-handed. He wants to accomplish something. He wants to be seen as a burglar. It's that tookish instinct really kind of taking over. Although it is also the Baggins-ish instinct, right? This is part of Tolkien's genius when it comes to navigating these two halves, these two opposing halves of Bilbo's character, is that there is an element of the Baggins that wants to be thought of well, that wants to be seen as capable and professional and trustworthy, right? He is contracted to do this job now, so it's not just about an adventure, it's also about brilliantly upholding his end of the bargain. It's also about him kind of maintaining that social stability by being honest and by keeping his part of this contract that has been agreed to. With all of that said, let's get into the talking purse. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! Thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. Here, who are you? It squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. So here we are. My intention here isn't really to build an argument, right? Or to convince anyone that I'm right, per se. There is space for a multitude of opinions. But if we are looking at the sweep of the legendarium, the talking purse really stands out, particularly if we're already primed by the orderly, cozy, low magic beginning to this book, right? We've talked about Gandalf's fireworks and we've talked about his smoke rings, but that's really it. The greatest magic that we've seen so far, perhaps appropriately enough, has been the magic of poetry and song. That's the most transportive, transformative event that we have experienced. The talking purse belongs to an entirely different tradition. Well, okay, let's be candid. Not an entirely different tradition. There is precedence. There is one other object in the entire Legendarium which speaks. In the story of the children of Húrin, Turin Turambar wields the black sword Gurthang, which is reforged from the sword Anglical, which is forged from a meteorite by Eol the Dark Elf that he surrenders to King Thingol as tribute. Thingol gives it ultimately to Turin. Turin, through the course of his life, commits all kinds of terrible acts, both deliberately and by accident, but ultimately he uses Gurthang to kill Glaurung the dragon in single combat, though he falls into unconsciousness at the end of the battle. When he wakes, he is approached by Brandir, the former leader of the encampment where Turin has been living, who tells Turin that his wife, Niniel, is actually his sister, Nienor, and that she is dead. Turin, in response, kills Brandir right there, only to learn later that Brandir is telling the truth. He then, in what might generously be described as a somewhat heightened emotional state, well, let's look at the slide, I guess, right? Then he drew forth his sword and said, "Hail, Gurthang, Iron of Death, you alone now remain. But what lord or loyalty do you know save the hand that wields you? From no blood will you shrink. Will you take Turin Turambar? Will you slay me swiftly?" And from the blade rang a cold voice in answer. "Yes, I will drink your blood, that I might forget the blood of Beleg, my master, and the blood of Brandir slain unjustly. I will slay you swiftly." Then Turin set the hilts upon the ground and cast himself upon the point of Gurthang, and the black blade took his life. Beleg, their reference to Beleg Cuthalion, Beleg Strongbow, the former friend of Turin and original wielder of Anglical, who he also took from, who he originally, I guess, took from Turgon. It is passed to Turin after the fact. So those are the only two instances. That sword in that very dramatic scene and the talking purse in this scene, those are the only two instances of an object talking. And it sits uncomfortably. Obviously, both, because we are in a somewhat heightened emotional state, can be attributed to some kind of hallucination, some kind of narrative flourish, some kind of metaphor, right? You can attribute, particularly Gurthang, I think, you can attribute to a moment of very, heightened emotional instability there. But even here, I think that Bilbo was under an enormous amount of pressure, and perhaps he imagined that that is what he heard. Perhaps there was a sound, perhaps something. All of this is to say that I am unconvinced that the talking purse exists. I'm just going to lay that out there. In part because talking is so significant. The ability to talk is so significant in Tolkien's, well, I was going to say Legendarium, but I think that I mean philosophy. I think that I mean that it is deeper than that. I think that when the elves awake at Cuivinan in the beginning of the Silmarillion, they name themselves the Quenya, right? They name themselves the Quendi, excuse me, not the Quenya. They name themselves the Quendi, which means those who speak, right? They speak Quenya. They speak the language of the elves. Because speaking is so important. That is how they differentiate themselves from everything else in the world around them. That is what is special. That is what is remarkable about the Quendi at that point. And the ability to use language is generally reserved for those creatures which are more than the constraints of their flesh, right? The children of Iluvatar, certainly. The dwarves, the adopted children of Iluvatar, yes. The orcs, the perverted and twisted children of Iluvatar, yes, okay. The Balrogs, it seems, do not speak, for all that they are presumably Maiar capable of speech before their ultimate, transformation, corruption, domination into the form of Balrogs. It seems as though they maybe were able to speak and now have lost that ability. The ability of Glaurung and indeed of Smaug the dragon to speak is indicative of their particular and personal power. It is a thing that sets them apart from other beasts that might look something like them. They are specifically imbued with power and authority because they can talk. And the presence of this talking purse seems to me to stand in contradiction of that. It seems to me to be more of a fairy tale element and less of a legendarium element. And there is an argument that I've heard put forth here that, in fact, the talking purse is not talking per se, but that it is an artifact, that it is an enchanted object that doesn't possess a personality or a spirit or an ability to kind of articulate its own experience of the world, but rather that it is just it's an alarm clock. It is a car alarm. It is a security device that just goes off if someone other than its owner touches it, which I don't know. I mean, you have to then create the circumstances by which this purse exists as large as a bag to Bilbo, right? So of significant size, which means that it probably wasn't crafted by dwarves. It may not even have been crafted by elves. It has to have this enchantment. We have to speculatively just decide that that kind of enchantment exists within the world of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And then we have to backfill an origin story for this artifact, and then we have to get it into the pockets of the trolls, which is perhaps the easiest step, all told. And I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced in largest part with that argument because it so clearly replicates the vocal patterns of the trolls themselves, right? As it has the, hey, who are you, right? It's got this very kind of trollish approach to its dialogue. So I am inclined to read it as a piece of fairy tale-alia. I'll need to, fairy-talia? It doesn't quite work either, does it? I'll have to figure that out and get to it. All of this is to say, let me cut ahead and show you this 1954 letter to Peter Hastings, who I believe was the owner of a Catholic bookshop. So his letters to Professor Tolkien are very concerned with the Catholicism or not of Professor Tolkien's writings. So Hastings writes to Tolkien, and this is part of the reply on the subject of the creation of orcs and trolls and the question of pity. And Tolkien writes this: but there are other sorts of trolls besides these rather ridiculous, if brutal, stone trolls for which other origins are suggested. Of course, since inevitably my world is highly imperfect even on its own plane, nor made wholly coherent, our real world does not appear to be wholly coherent either. And I am actually not myself convinced that, though in every world, on every plane, all must ultimately be under the will of God, even in ours there are not some tolerated subcreational counterfeits. When you make trolls speak, you are giving them a power which in our world probably connotes the possession of a soul. But I do not agree, if you admit that fairy story element, that my trolls show any sign of good, strictly and unsentimentally viewed. I do not say William felt pity, a word to me of moral and imaginative worth. It is the pity of Bilbo and later Frodo that ultimately allows the quest to be achieved, and I do not think he showed pity. I might not, if The Hobbit had been more carefully written and my world so much thought about 20 years ago, have used the expression poor little blighter, just as I should not have called the troll William. So in this letter, of course, Tolkien is pushing back against the juvenilia. He is pushing back against the childlike elements, or the childish elements of The Hobbit, which he was already somewhat dissatisfied with by the time that the book was published and became increasingly dissatisfied with as the decades rolled on. Thus, that fifth phase, 1960, returned to The Hobbit to strip out some of these less appropriate elements. Unfortunately, though in theory that 1960 rewrite does get to the beginning of chapter 3, it does not include much of the trolls at all, and certainly nothing at all about the purse. That's not to say that it has removed the purse. It is to say that that manuscript is incomplete. So we don't know for sure what he was thinking about in terms of revisiting this question of the talking purse. But you'll note here what really stands out, right? Beside his assertion that even his secondary creation, as well thought about as it is, as carefully constructed as it is, that it is imperfect, it is not wholly coherent, and even though he acknowledges that the real world, being under the dominion of the will of God, and thus every subcreative world, right, everything that flows forth from that primary act of creation into acts of secondary creation, must also be under the will of God, even the real world might not be completely coherent by the standards of like the most rigorous analysis, that there might be some just weird stuff out there that kind of transgresses these tolerated subcreational counterfeits. But he acknowledges here part of the importance of speech, that when you make trolls speak, you are giving them power, quote, which in our world probably connotes the possession of a soul, and which historically in Tolkien's own secondary creation also kind of connotes the existence of a soul. It is the ensouled creatures who speak. We don't populate the world of Arda with talking animals. This is not Narnia, right? We don't populate the world of Arda with very few kind of anthropomorphic personifications within non-human or non-living realms, right? We have the elves, the dwarves, the man. We have the hobbits descended from man. We have the orcs corrupted from elves. In some versions, we have trolls corrupted from man. That's one of the theories that he was kicking around in an attempt to find a solution to this. But in all these spaces, we find that speech is something important. It is something approaching sacred. It is something approaching the first power and to some extent most important duty of the ensouled creature, of the creature of both Hroa and Fea, right? Of body and of soul. So all of this is to say here, as I realize that I've spent a lot of time here. Oh, Andrea's calling out, what about ants? Yes, ants too, right? Absolutely. And so the thing which I think distinguishes the ant from the trees which they shepherd is the ability of speech, or perhaps I'm getting that backwards. I do think it would also be fair to say that so great are the ants that they spontaneously have the ability to speak. I think that you can look at it in either way. It's not to suggest that, well, I mean, that's whether the ants have a soul is a more complicated topic, right? Where exactly the ants come from and what exactly their nature is. We have that scene with Yavanna and Manwë at the end of the chapter of Aule and Yavanna when she goes to Manwë and says, look, he's just made dwarves and now this is it. Like the children of Iluvatar, and now these dwarves are just going to take apart the beings of my creation, the flora and the fauna of my creation, and is no one going to take care of them? And Manwë says, well, I don't know, man. I mean, I just, this isn't really my area. I don't really know what's happening. And then Yavanna seems to recall that in the music, the ants too were foreshadowed, or depending on your reading strategy, you might interpret that as being a moment of revelation from Iluvatar, that in fact the ants are present in the music too. Either way you read it, the ants are there and were intended from the beginning. Are they Maiar? Like probably, right? That's the only kind of category of being that can fulfill what we expect from what we expect from those kinds of creatures, and certainly what we witness as we look at Treebeard and the ants of Fangorn Forest during the assault on Isengard in particular, right? We see a kind of capacity for action and certainly a capacity for speech, coupled with a capacity for self-determination, which seems to be very powerful. Yes, thank you, Andrea, for that great question. That's a really good clarifying point. All right, we must move on because I am already 2/3 through my time and this show is running away from me. All of this is to say, let me make sure. Yes, good, I am up on your screen. This is not still the letter. I'm addressing you here in the camera. All of this is to say, not just that I want to like take the fun out of The Hobbit, right? I just want to say, no, this is fairy tale nonsense, and I really want this to be like grim, dark, like serious adult business. I resent that Tolkien didn't finish that 5th phase rewrite and give us the Lord of the Rings version of The Hobbit where everyone is edgy and growling and dirty all the time, right? Like the Game of Thrones version of The Hobbit. I think The Hobbit works in the ways in which The Hobbit works, primarily because of its tone, primarily because of its the approach that it takes to its content, right? That narrative voice, those narrative voices, as we discussed last week, are so important, so critical. So I'm not looking just to strip out the magic. I'm not looking just to strip out all of those things which seem fun and or silly. What I'm looking here to do is to question really where these things come from. I'm questioning at what point was, if we concede that the talking purse is not really real, if we concede that the talking purse is just a bit of fun, if we concede that the talking purse is included in the story to defray attention from the moment of Bilbo's capture, which would be, under normal circumstances, a frightening moment, right? If this is a moment of magical treachery rather than imminent violence, then the whole story becomes more palatable to its juvenile readership, to its intended audience. And the question is, who adds this into the story? Is it Bilbo? Is it a later writer? And we can't really ever completely resolve that. But what it allows us to do, rather than, looking at this talking person saying, this talking person does not belong in the story because it isn't canon, right? Which is a dangerous word, a super dangerous word for a Tolkien podcaster to use in this day and age. Rather than just saying, this is not canon, this is not real, this is not true, we can recognize that it is emotionally true. We can recognize that it is metaphorically true. We can recognize that it is narratively true in a way that might not still connote literal accuracy, right? What it gives us in return is permission to speculate about the role of this benevolently unreliable narrator, to allow us to look into the story and to determine more of what is real and why these changes have been made. Do I think that the trolls here are really these Cockney working class guys possessed of a magic purse? I don't think that fits the schematic. It doesn't fit the historical influences of trolls, right? Coming out of Norse and Icelandic myth, the troll being like an older word that is used dismissively or critically or insultingly of the race of giants of the North, right? These ideas don't flow readily into this working class depiction of trolls in the pages of The Hobbit, but I am intrigued by the idea that what is actually happening is Bilbo repositioning these dangerous creatures as something more comedic, as something more ridiculous, in order to create accessibility for the juvenile reader. And I'm crediting Bilbo here, right, somewhat speciously, as the diegetic creator of this original story. Of course, all of this really comes back to Tolkien, but Tolkien was paying very close attention to who the in-universe authors of these texts were. So I guess if I'm crediting Tolkien, then I'm crediting Tolkien, crediting Bilbo in this particular regard. All right, we must move on here as we are drawing close. We get the scene in which the trolls begin to... well, we get first, of course, the intrusion of the dwarves, effectively one by one, which I had never realized, I think, until thinking about it very clearly today, turns the appearance of the dwarves one by one into a three-beat in the story. We're not just opposing the unexpected party and the arrival of the dwarves under Gandalf's aegis at Beorn's house. Now we're also interposing that with this comedic kind of repeated stumbling into the same trap, right? Which is actually quite a funny idea now that you present it like that. But we have the dwarves being captured. We have Bilbo trying to save them, trying to negotiate with the trolls, trying to buy them just some time. And then we have the moment of ventriloquism, right? Another ridiculous moment, another moment of, I guess, ambiguous magic. It is unclear whether Gandalf is using magic to mimic the voices of the trolls, or whether this is just a weird talent that he has that he never shows again. Maybe, he's been kicking around for like 1,000 years at this point. He's had a lot of time to practice his ventriloquism. And then we get the moment of revelation, the application of knowledge in terms that are definitive for our heroes here. "Dawn take you all and be stoned to you," said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't. For just at that moment the light came over the hill and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone unless the birds perch on them. For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of and never move again. That is what happened to Bert and Tom and William. "Excellent," said Gandalf as he stepped from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. Trickery, right? Fairy tale trickery. We allow the trolls, we cause the trolls, we incite the trolls to defeat themselves, according to the rules of evil in Tolkien's Legendarium, right? They are petty and violent and selfish and small, and thus they are manipulable. Thus they are delayed until not Gandalf's power, but the natural world, the natural order of these things can rectify the problem, can freeze these three giant trolls and turn them simply to stone. It is not exactly a moment of eucatastrophe, right? We do have the intrusion of Gandalf. We have the acknowledged intrusion of Gandalf, but we also have this moment of luck. Had Bilbo taken any different steps through the course of the evening, it isn't at all clear that Gandalf would have arrived before the dwarves had been, turned into a pie, right? As the trolls obviously want. So there is a quality of self-preservation. There is a quality of heroism, right? That, I think, is the reason that this is described somewhat pedantically. When Frodo and the others in The Lord of the Rings finally find this site, and Frodo has this moment of, oh, we're forgetting our family history. This is the moment. And the narrative voice tells us that this is the site of Bilbo's first successful adventure. The degree to which it is Bilbo's first successful adventure, I think, rests upon his ability to forestall the darkest possible outcome of this encounter for long enough. It is not that he gains victory over the trolls. It is not that he himself tricks the trolls, at least not comprehensively, right? Not completely. Gandalf is the one that comes in with the high-level trickery. Bilbo is the one that just keeps them all alive for long enough. And in that sense, we might think of it as Bilbo's first successful adventure. It is certainly Bilbo's first attempt at burglarious conduct, which we'll circle back to in the pages to come. We have another major event, of course, which we must talk about before we wrap up this week's chapter, because if we are talking about reading The Hobbit in the context of the Silmarillion, then I think that there are few pleasures greater than the discovery of the troll horde, right? I guess we should talk about the key, too. Gandalf proving, for the second time if you're reading The Hobbit after The Lord of the Rings, or for the first time if you're reading The Hobbit first, of course, Gandalf demonstrating once again that for all of his much vaunted skill, right, for all that he claims when we're at the Holland Gate to Moria, that he has memorized all the spells that you can use to open a gate, I can remember 20 of them without even trying, or whatever it is that he says at that point, right? I'm paraphrasing, but that is roughly what he says. For all of that, dude is bad with doors. He's bad with doors. It takes Bilbo finding the tiny little, well, tiny to the trolls, the significant stone key here, so that we can unlock the troll horde, which again does not feel trollish, right? It doesn't feel completely consistent. It doesn't feel completely true that they came down from the mountains recently enough that they are still like finding their feet, recently enough that they are still settling in, recently enough that the memory of the mountains is still fresh for them. But they also just have this magic cave with a large stone door that opens to a key wherein they keep all of their treasure, the discarded garments of the villagers that they have eaten, and their very well stocked pantry. And of course, 3 ancient blades of the Elder Days. And as I say, if you are reading this as I am reading this, in the light of the Silmarillion, few things are as exciting as finding Orcrist and Glamdring, right? These swords of Gondolin, these fabled blades, which are so resonant coming out of the Silmarillion directly into the Hobbit. This feels, in a very unexpected place, in a very unexpected time, in a very unexpected way, this feels like a silver thread tying us back to, in some senses, the height of elven civilization in Beleriand. Glamdring was wielded by King Turgon himself, presumably in the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. Orcrist thought to be wielded by Ecthelion, captain of Gondolin. These are manufactured between the 2nd and 5th centuries of the Years of the Sun, so gosh, where are we now? 6,500 years ago, something like that, right? It's a brilliantly mythic moment of chance, if chance you call it. Interesting beat here that Gandalf's inability to identify the runes on the swords, right? We're not going to know that they're Glamdring and Orcrist until we get to Rivendell, and Elrond helps identify them. And Tolkien was bothered by that. Gandalf's inability to identify the swords was one of those perplexing puzzles that he was working through as he was writing that 5th phase 1960 revision of The Hobbit. And his solution was really quite brilliant, which is simply that the swords are so filthy. The runes upon the swords are so dirty, so filthy, right? Not with, interestingly, dirt or, soil, dust, cobwebs, whatever trash the trolls have been leaving around, whatever has happened to them in the thousands of years since they were last used, but actually with the blood of orcs from the fall of Gondolin, which is just like that's chef kiss good. That's so good. So then they're taken to Elrond, and that is when they are cleaned up. They are purged of their authentic First Age orc blood. We're going to get to that next week as we go to look at a short rest in which we meet elves, many of whom are singing Tra-la-la-lally, and we understand that we understand the swords that we have found, and we understand the moon letters on the map. All of that is going to be waiting for us next week. But I do want to pause just before we wrap up tonight's session to acknowledge the way in which Tolkien is building out what we will see from Bilbo through... Well, it's almost too large to say what we will see from Bilbo, right? Tolkien is building out what will be Bilbo's experience through the entire story, even here in this first microcosmic encapsulation of that entire journey, right? I mentioned a little last week that The Hobbit is not really like technically structured chiastically. That is to say that the climax of the story is not in the midpoint, and then we do not kind of reverse back out of the plot the way that we enter into the plot, right? That normally that would be your classic symmetrical chiastic structure. Here we're doing something similar, but it is very different because the climax is so close to the end, and then the rewinding through the story, the return into the West from the wild, really happens quite quickly. But one of the interesting things that Tolkien is doing structurally is that Bilbo will continue to encounter these episodic adventures that act as tiny little encapsulations of the adventure that he is about to endure as a whole. He is going to be confronted by a challenge, and he is going to seek to overcome that challenge, or initially at least engage with that challenge in a Tookish way, as he does here. He seeks to pickpocket the trolls, just so he can return to the dwarves and say, check it out. I am a burglar. I told you. Gandalf was right. He was not wrong to put his faith in me. I can do the thing when I need to do the thing, right? So this is a kind of Tookish intent, though, as I said earlier, it is still melded with this Bagginsish intent because he wants to be thought well of. He wants to be decent. He wants to be kind of respectable, even if the area in which he is seeking respect is a kind of disreputable area, right? He wants both of these things that speak to both sides of his personality. And then in that moment, tragedy is going to strike, like calamity will strike. Something bad is going to happen to him. And the thing that gets him out of it is not his Tookishness. It is his Bagginsishness. What we see with the trolls here is, I think, a microcosm of what we see with Gollum beneath the Misty Mountains. It is microcosmically what we see of Bilbo in the Hall of the Elven King in Mirkwood. It is what we see of Bilbo in Erebor when he's confronting Smaug. His Bagginsish qualities are those qualities which allow him to navigate these moments of high adventure and moments of high danger in ways which his enemy does not expect. His enemy, his adversary, does not expect, right? He is inadvertently outthinking his opponents because he is who he is. And I think that it is very easy to look at this tension, even if you are a careful enough reader, a sophisticated enough reader, a long-term enough reader to look at the pages of The Hobbit and to understand this dynamic, this duality at the heart of Bilbo Baggins, right? This is the duality that is laid out just so beautifully and precisely and carefully by Professor Corey Olsen in his book Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which I have beside me here. This duality is enormously purposeful, but one of the things that often gets overlooked, I think, is the strength that comes from the Baggins side, the skill that comes from the Baggins side, the power to resolve these moments of crisis and climax, whether it is the trolls or the spiders, or it's dealing with Thorin himself and the Arkenstone by the time we get to Erebor, right? The thing that allows Bilbo to navigate these situations is his Bagginsishness. And I really want to keep an eye on that as we move forward, because I do think that it is often overlooked. That, I think, then here at, I've got 4 minutes left. That is going to do it for this evening's recording. Thank you so much. I hope that the somewhat ramshackle beginning to tonight's session, which has now, of course, been deleted. If you're listening to the podcast after the fact, if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, you'll never know that it even happened. But a bit of a misfire right at the beginning of tonight's show that has now thankfully not been repeated, so that's good. I am going to wrap up here. I am going to bid you all adieu and let you know that I will see you again on Sunday I won't see you. It's a pre-recorded episode. That is a force of habit that I will try and break as we get through it. On Sunday, there will be a new episode of Shire Reckoning, in which I will offer some more thoughts on Tolkien and answer some more listener questions and present you all with a new question of the week. If you are a Patreon supporter, if you are pledging $5 a month or more to help me continue doing this kind of work, then you can head on over to the Patreon page right now, patreon.com/nextword, where you can find the link to Last Call at the Green Dragon, my after show, where I am going to go and fix a drink and then come back and talk for half an hour or more about what are we going to talk about? Maybe some canon. Maybe I'll approach the thorny, knotty question of canon, the question that got the aforementioned Dr. Corey Olsen into some social media trouble not so very long ago when he was talking about the Rings of Power. Maybe we'll talk a little about that. And maybe we'll talk a little more about ants, just for the sake of it. What do you say, Andrea? I think that ants are always a good topic. That is going to do it for this week's episode. As I say, next week we're going to be coming back to a short rest, right? That's, yes, of course we are. We're going to make it to Rivendell. We're going to find out about swords. We're going to get our moon letters, and then we're going to be ready to move into the second phase of our adventure with a great deal of purpose. And if you think that it is interesting reading The Hobbit through the lens of the Silmarillion, just you wait till we get to Rivendell. That is going to do it for this week's show. Thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then.